Hello, good morning to everyone in Western Canada and good afternoon to those of us in Central and Eastern Canada. Thanks for joining us. We have a strong group today representing a lot of different parts of the community, provincial and municipal governments, community agencies, the private sector, post-secondary institutions, professional associations, research groups. I'm really pleased with the people who've signed up for this. My name is Joan Andrew, and I'm your moderator today for this Hire Immigrants webinar. Currently, I'm the public servant in residence at Ryerson University after working in the public sector for 36 years, roughly half in the federal government and half in the Ontario government. I have served a number of different roles, but probably the one most relevant to today's webinar was that my last job in the public sector was Deputy Minister of Citizenship and Immigration and Women's Issues in Ontario. I'm pleased to moderate today's webinar as I've been keenly interested in and involved in exploring how governments can improve their support and engagement with the employer community to improve employment prospects for new immigrants. Today's webinar will focus on a new report that tackles that challenge, Brokering Success, from the Mowat Center, and it focuses on improving employment outcomes for skilled immigrants through strengthened government-employer engagement. At the end of this webinar, a link will appear on your screen, and you can download the full report. The research was conducted by the Mowat Center and was funded by Maytree. Let me tell you a little bit about Hire Immigrants, who's hosting today's webinar. Hire Immigrants is an initiative of the Global Diversity Exchange at Ryerson University. The Global Diversity Exchange is a think and do tank on diversity, migration, and inclusion that connects local experience and ideas with global networks. The Global Diversity Exchange is funded by Maytree. As with previous Hire Immigrant webinars, this presentation will be recorded and made available online for those unable to join us today, or if you want to review or share any part of the presentation with your colleagues. Today we will hear from two speakers, Matthew Mendelsohn and Ratna Ahmedvar. Matthew will cover the findings of the study, and Ratna will highlight some of the recommendations that emerge from the report. Then I'll pose a couple of questions to both Matthew and Ratna, and after that brief conversation, we'll ask our panelists to respond to the audience Q&A. We want to make sure we leave sufficient time to have them answer your questions, so let's get started. I'll introduce our two speakers. Matthew Mendelsohn founded the Mowat Center at the School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Toronto in 2009. It delivers research-driven recommendations on Canada's most challenging policy problems and serves as Ontario's independent voice on public policy. He now works on evidence-based policy solutions, particularly those designed to strengthen Ontario and Canada and transform how governments deliver public goods. From 2004 to 2009, Matthew served as Deputy Minister in the Ontario government and held responsibility for intergovernmental affairs, the Democratic Renewal Secretariat, and the Office of International Relations and Protocol. He was also Associate Secretary to Cabinet in Cabinet Office. He spent 10 years before that as a member of the Political Studies Department at Queen's University and served as the Director of the Canadian Opinion Research Archive. From 96 to 98, Matthew was a Senior Advisor in the Privy Council Office in Ottawa. He and I are both on the board on committees. Matthew's on the board of the United Way Toronto, Civics, the Council of the Great Lakes Region, and l'Idée Fédérale. And he and I were colleagues together in the Ontario government. Ratna Ahmedvar. Ratna is the founding executive director of the Global Diversity Exchange at Ryerson. GDX is a think and do tank on diversity and inclusion with a migration lens. It connects local experience and ideas with global networks and is dedicated to building a community of international leadership that sees strength in immigration and its attendant diversity. Prior to this role, she was president of Maytree, a private foundation focused on poverty reduction, immigrant integration, and inclusion and diversity in the workplace. She is the Chair Emeritus of the Toronto Region Immigrant Employment Council and co-chair of Diverse City, the Greater Toronto Leadership Project, and the director of the Canadian Club of Toronto, the Anne Veronics Institute, and Samara. She has been appointed to the Order of Ontario and is a member of the Order of Canada. Ratna and I have worked together for a number of years on a variety of issues as well. And so Ratna, I will turn it over to you, and could you tell us why it was important to do this study?
Thank you, Joan, and thank you for moderating this webinar. When we undertook the study about a year ago, exactly a year ago, Matthew and I started to have this conversation. We were really curious, and I was still at Matry at that time, we were really curious to explore and understand the levers that governments at all levels have at their disposal to engage employers, either through regulation or through policies or through legislation or through programs. And we asked Mohit the question, who has tried what seems to work where and why, and to help this conversation about employer engagement and the labor market integration of immigrants move to a next level. Even as I look back in this 1 year, I'm amazed at how deep in some aspects the conversation about employer engagement is and how shallow it is. So I think there are some contradictions here, which I can talk about later. But I want to first hand it over to Matthew to take us through the research, the methodology, the findings before we get to the recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ratna, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I just want to say that I'm here with Andrew Galley. Jill Shurry was not able to be here. They're the actual authors of this study, and I think they did a good job, and I encourage people to download it. There'll be a number of things that I'll talk about that I won't go into great detail about, and as I mentioned, I wasn't the lead author on this study, so there may be specific points of detail that if people are interested in, we're releasing the study, and I think that the questions that you may have on specific program details will be in there. What I'm really interested in is the issues that have arisen over the last decade, the stubborn income and unemployment gaps between skilled immigrants and their Canadian-born peers, how these have gotten worse and more stubborn or difficult to address over the last 2 decades to 1 decade, depending on what data you're looking at. And despite the fact that there are clearly many people working in the area, in the sector, and lots of government programs, not-for-profit engagement, and private sector initiatives to try and overcome these, some are successful, but at a macro level, we remain stuck. And so part of the goal of this study was to help understand why that would be and what other jurisdictions have done that has been successful, and what may be going on in Canada that has been successful that could be brought to scale or more widely disseminated and used across the country. So what we were focused on was how governments engage with employers on the issue of employing skilled immigrants. And so that is particularly related to the evolving conversation about demand-driven engagement rather than supply-driven engagement in the training and employment readiness space. And so while there have always been combinations of both, there is a consensus that much of the last 30 years has been focused on the skills and abilities of those seeking work, whether skilled immigrants or others, whether random unemployed people who walk into an employment center run by the government or run by someone else. The focus has been on helping those who are seeking employment improve their skills or improve their ability to find work. and that obviously remains a crucial element in this space. But over the last number of years, there has been an increasing focus on demand-driven programs and engaging more clearly with employers on what their needs are and whether government or others can help fill those needs. So that is the focus of the study, which is how governments engage with employers on the issue of employing skilled immigrants. Are there better ways for government to understand what employers need, support employers in finding the skilled talent they need, placing skilled immigrants in particular employment? And the next question is what tools governments have at their disposal to improve this engagement and to improve outcomes. So what has government done here? What might they do in the future? And what have they done elsewhere? So that was the focus of the study. And Andrew and Jill conducted 80 interviews across 10 provinces with people representing government, employers, not-for-profits, and immigrant employment councils. We are very grateful to people who participated in those interviews, and we hope the study has done those comments justice, and that people think it was a useful way to spend an hour and a half of their time, and some of the people I know who were interviewed are registered for this call. The other thing that I think is particularly important, which people would be aware of, is that we are at a crucial moment, not just in terms of the things I talked about previously in terms of the persistent and stubborn gap and the fact that we are moving towards a focus on demand-driven and employer-based programs, but also that we have strategic windows of opportunity at the moment, in particular the labor market agreements, which are in the process, which have been signed by federal government and provincial territorial governments, but which are in the process of now working through the details of those agreements. So for those of us who have been in the intergovernmental policy world, what have been agreed to so far are framework agreements between federal and provincial governments, but that doesn't mean that all of the details of what programs will actually be funded and how outcomes will be measured, that all of those things are still being negotiated. And so we do have a window of opportunity around the labor market agreements, which have evolved into the Canada Job Grants and the Canada Job Funds. So we have that window of opportunity around negotiating those Canada Job Funds and what will be in the specific programs. We also are at a time when the federal government has committed to rolling out an express entry system of case management for our immigration intake system. And what is surprising to me is how little public attention there has been to this significant change. Clearly, people within this space are aware of these changes, but even today, if one goes on the Citizenship and Immigration website, it is hard to figure out the exact details of what this new system will look like, but there remains a commitment that it will be implemented in less than 4 weeks. And part of the motivation for that is to select immigrants who are job ready, who have employment offers or employment contracts, and a pathway to permanent residency. And so those two together, the Canada Job Funds coming out of the labor market agreements and the express entry system, really have as part of their motivation articulated by the federal government is to bridge some of the gap between economic outcomes of skilled immigrants and their Canadian-born peers. And I would say that some of the details remain to be worked out. So I think as a community of interest, we can try and help shape those to some extent. Sorry, I've just done something here on my screen that has made it go blank. Oh, we're back. Sorry,
back
people.
up.
Thank you very much. That was the first of many mistakes I'm sure I will make technically over the course of the next few minutes. So let's go into the main body of the paper. So the main body of the paper really asks the question, what tools does government have at its disposal to address this issue? And just to underline again and summarize, I really like to be very clear about what problem we are trying to solve, and when one undertakes policy or program design or development or renewal, it's just very important to be clear about what problem we're trying to solve and what our objective is. And so for us in this, the problem is the continued wage gap and unemployment gap and underemployment gap, skilled immigrants and their Canadian-born counterparts, and looking at the tools that government has at its disposal to address some of these things. So the first thing we wanted to talk about was legislation and policy. The issue of legislation and policy, first is the question of the who is accepted through the immigration system. And we are familiar with the Provincial nominee program and temporary foreign workers in the Canadian experience class. And there is a recognition that for many employers, they are seeking a nimble, quick response to their labor market needs. The temporary foreign worker program or the Provincial nominee program are not always quick, but they can be responsive. And so there are obviously some unscrupulous employers who are focused on lower wages and a more exploitable labor market pool, and that remains a significant policy issue that needs to be addressed. But I think that is a different issue than the one we're addressing here, which is that for many employers, they are genuinely looking to find the skilled labor that they need. And if we could find other solutions, and the solution we focus on in this paper is better mobilizing skilled immigrants who are already here and creating systems that allow employers to more easily access, understand, and know skilled immigrants who are here, that may decrease pressure on the TFW program. And obviously the federal government has made changes which will decrease demand for the TFW program. The other issue is equity legislation and other legislation for the protection of workers and workers' rights. In the end, most of the people we spoke to in our own conclusion was that employment equity is probably not the right lens through which to think about skilled immigrant labor. There are obviously equity issues around discrimination and race and country of origin, but in terms of immigration status, the equity lens is probably not going to be the most effective one. But finding additional ways of protecting workers in different ways might be, and many people raised the issue of Manitoba's RAPA model, which forces recruiters who are recruiting overseas to be licensed, and employers who are using temporary foreign workers to be licensed. But there might be ways of expanding this model, using it as a way of connecting with skilled immigrant workers who are already here, using the licensing process to enable employers to improve their capacity or register for different kinds of programs that might connect them with skilled labor that is already available, rather than resorting to the immigration system or the temporary foreign worker system itself. The other thing that, the second lever that we focus on are the economic development offices, and that already conduct sometimes employer outreach. But what we found in our interviews was that the economic development officers and organizations often don't have the labor market piece as a formal part of their mandate, and this creates a challenge of silos, which people consistently raise in just about every policy space. But here, it does seem that there is an opportunity, if we are trying to improve employers' ability to engage with skilled immigrants and government's ability to support the real existing needs of employers to hire, that one should be looking at ways to make sure that the economic development programs, policies, officers, and outreach that governments undertake, which usually focus on things like investment recruitment or business retention, that they are also engaged and integrated with the work that is taking place in employment services, workforce planning, and job training. The third lever that we focus on is the employment and settlement services. Governments fund employment and settlement services. Traditionally, that has been around what I talked about earlier in terms of job readiness. But one can be looking for additional ways of funding employment and settlement services. There are wage subsidies. One can be looking at mentoring and skills bridging that, if done through the lens and interests of employers, might be actually quite helpful and combine some of the skills training and bridge training that might be classically what we would call supply side with the actual needs of employers. But that requires real engagement with employers who are seeking skilled labor. Finally, the final tool is intermediaries. The intermediaries are significant organizations in many spaces. They would include sector councils and professional and industry associations, business council, boards of trade. There are a variety of sectoral intermediaries that have played important roles, and they often have sector-specific knowledge. They have detailed labor market information about their sector. They often are engaged with a consistent network of employers over time. They tend not to have sustainable funding models, and so they can be cyclical in their interest or engagement with these issues. But based on our interviews, we would recommend that governments be even more engaged with the intermediary organizations than they have been, because the intermediary organizations can sometimes be a more stable, insightful lens into employers' interests and demands and needs than any one employer at any one time. In the paper, and I'm not going to go into detail here, but because I do want to move along to Ratna's recommendation, the paper's recommendations, which I'll hand over to Ratna, and also the, and I want to make sure we have a good chunk of time for Q&A. But the paper does describe a number of innovative models that we think are worth exploring for municipal, regional, provincial, territorial, and federal governments here in Canada. Not so much federal, because they don't actually run many programs, but for the other governments, there are a number of emerging demand-driven innovative programs that appear to be having some success, and by some success, we are focused on ones that can deliver measurable impact. not just ones that have process success where people are happy that they went through it or that employers felt that they had a good experience, but ones that are actually delivering real outcome and real impact and improved outcomes. We identify a number of principles for action that are kind of at a pretty high level, but we don't think they are just amorphous policy talk. We actually think that when looking at programs in the job funds and other funds that governments are, and other programs that governments are considering funding and new actions that governments are considering to engage employers, that these are real principles that they should apply to existing or potentially new programs because they are more likely to achieve success. One, obviously, is that there is not a one-size-fits-all, and that means that small and large provinces or jurisdictions are going to be different. Larger provinces may have to work with sectoral councils and intermediaries more, whereas it may be possible for smaller jurisdictions to actually work with specific employers. It is important to recognize that we do have at the moment a very regionally segmented labor market, and the solutions in Saskatchewan are going to look quite different than the solutions in Quebec. We think it's really important to provide increased and targeted support to smaller enterprises. Often smaller enterprises really do have needs for skilled labor, and there often are skilled immigrants in their community who might be able to fill labor market needs, but small employers often don't have the capacity to engage with the kinds of programs that exist, and they often can't engage with the kinds of programs if it is at their own initiative. So helping intermediaries and help SMEs and helping SMEs as well in a direct way are important principles. The other thing that we highlight is that there's a lot of jargon in all sectors, in all policy areas, but here it seems particularly important to try and break some of it down to build a common language and use plain language so that people can understand what they're referring to. We focused on the need for Canadian experience, and Canadian experience is often highlighted as something that employers require. And when you scratch below the surface, it isn't so much Canadian experience that is really needed. Canadian experience is being used as a proxy for some sectors that skilled immigrants may in fact have. And so trying to build out a common language, which might be competency-based, which highlights what skills are actually needed rather than using the Canadian experience language as a proxy for something else is important, and continuing with that competency-based common language is something that governments can help facilitate. The other principle we mention is stability in the programs and the importance of measuring, monitoring, but doing so in a way that is designed to promote stability. Everyone on this call, I am sure, is aware of how programs come and go based on a variety of different trends. And while it is certainly important to fund success and direct program dollars to those things that are working, at the same time, it is important that there is some stability within the system, and it will help governments better engage with employers, because employers will be more familiar with the programs that are available. And I had mentioned the express entry in the immigration system, which is designed to bring in skilled immigrants who have real links to actual jobs, and for those people who follow the immigration space and the temporary foreign worker program. I mean, the number of changes that have taken place in the last 2 years in the labor market agreement, Canada Job Grant, job funds, and then into temporary foreign worker or federal skilled trade worker program. I mean, the number of programs has grown exponentially, and that does not promote ease of engagement for government or for employers, particularly for SMEs. And with that, I will say I'll be ready for questions in a few minutes, but I'm going to turn it over to Ratna to talk through the recommendations from the paper.
Thank you, Matthew. That was terrific. So the recommendations, as I go through them, and I don't intend to go through all 10 of them in detail because the time doesn't permit it, but I would encourage people to download the recommendations and read and to download the paper and read the paper and the recommendations in detail. But as I go through them, let's keep in mind Matthew's 4 sort of overarching principles as we review these recommendations. You know, adapting to local needs, working with and supporting small enterprises, building a common language, and maybe we can talk about that a little further, and of course, supporting stability. So the 10 recommendations are anchored in these principles, and I'd like to break them down into 2 buckets. The first set of recommendations, the first 4, I believe, speak to processes that are internal to government. The report recommends government do business differently. And the second set relates to how governments engage with employers, so sort of external processes. So the first recommendation is that government must develop a clear strategy for engaging employers as an essential and embedded part of labor market policy and program development. In other words, it should take its brokering role really seriously because we stand a much better chance of doing better by doing with employers instead of doing to employers, as the case has been, and Matthew has pointed out some instances of that. But the report also recommends that an embedded engagement with employers also means paying attention to employers by size, employers by sector, and employers by region, so not a one-size-fits-all approach. The second recommendation talks about using an integrated whole-of-government approach, a horizontal approach that cuts across many ministries and departments within ministries and ministries within different levels of government, because aspects of workforce development are embedded at all 3 levels of government and in ministries and portfolios such as health, education, environment, economic development, foreign aid, even the military. And the report actually uses or puts forward again after many years the concept of tripartite agreements between 3 levels of government as an option as we go forward. And this is terminology that I'm remembering when we used this terminology. It was many, many years ago. But as many provinces have new political leadership, as many cities have new mayors, maybe the time is right to develop relationships that include all 3, the interests of the people as managed by all 3 levels of government. The third recommendation makes perfect common sense. It asks government to undertake a more rigorous analysis of the return on investment of these programs. And anecdotal evidence cannot and should not be used as a proxy for science, although I find that in our policy discourse we're more often than not basing some program development and policy changes on anecdotes. Coupled with this third recommendation is the need to harmonize metrics and evaluations of programs that may have different names but serve many of the same purposes, such as the Canada Jobs Grant or the Canada Jobs Fund. So when we're talking, let's say, about impact, we're all talking about the same kind of apples instead of different kinds of apples, oranges, and peaches. Finally, in this bucket, the next recommendation is, and this is, of course, we could have a whole webinar about this final recommendation alone, that government should support employers in hiring within Canada and provide avenues to employers to recruit from the talent pool that is already available, as opposed to looking at temporary foreign workers. And by doing so, by providing real, accessible, alive avenues to talent in Canada, government should diminish the appetite for temporary foreign workers as opposed to enhancing their appetite on this. The next the next bucket is the external recommendations. The first recommendation, and I don't want to speak too long because I see that the chat board is coming alive. The next set of recommendations really builds on a really good, promising practice that Moet found in Manitoba, the RAPA program, and it recommends that provinces should pass legislation to license recruiters and to register employers who are looking for temporary foreign workers. And here the magic is that before they're even able to look outside, this licensing process enables them to take a look at what community agencies are doing, the talent that is coming out of community colleges and local universities, et cetera, et cetera. The second recommendation points the need to harness locally based labor market information. We've had a lot of conversations in this country about the absence of timely labor market information. We've also had a lot of discussion about why it is so difficult to get timely labor market information on shortages and trends at a national basis. So this recommendation goes to the heart of that and suggests that labor market information that is locally based may actually be easier to collect and may be more relevant, but it also does not let the federal government off the hook because this is sort of an interim and incremental recommendation. We absolutely should not lose the call for national information. The next recommendation Matthew talked about a little bit, creating incentives for employers to move towards competency-based hiring practices. This is complicated to do. I would say it's complex to do. But when employers, and if you think of employers using Canadian work experience as at face value, then they're using that language as a proxy for something else. Let's help employers figure out what they actually mean and move them towards assessment processes that one can actually articulate and measure and assess, as opposed to something nebulous like Canadian work experience. And because this is difficult to do, the report recommends that there should be some incentives built in to encourage employers to do this. The next recommendation deals with government using levers and programs that bring employers to the table at a certain point in their life. So for instance, businesses have to get licenses and get get certain processes. That's a point in time when employers interact with government. And perhaps pilot programs could be instituted where that point in time can be used to bring employers to a greater degree of knowledge about the labor market pool, about competency-based assessment, about diversity hiring, et cetera, sort of using one opportunity to create another, in other words. And finally, employers must be given appropriate opportunities to provide feedback directly to government about their engagement, about their participation, what works, what doesn't. I really like what the report says and what Matthew said about disruption is great. Disruption brings innovation. But if something is working, then let's keep it going. So those were the 10 recommendations. And I'm a person who believes in ideas, and I would say that of these 10, if at least a significant number were followed, we would see greater traction, greater engagement, and better results. So finally, in closing, and as I read the report again, and I said, if we're going to move forward in implementing some of these recommendations or advocating for their implementation, because we're not government, at least most of us are not, then there are some challenges and opportunities that I see. And these are not all-encompassing. I'm sure there are many other challenges and opportunities, but some top-of-mind thinking rose to my mind. And the first is, of course, jurisdiction. Regardless of which way you look in creating some traction, jurisdiction rears its head, who is responsible for doing what, to whom. But the report does point a way forward, and I'd like us to pay some attention to the flavor of the report that recommends local action, a concentration on small enterprises as a way forward and as a point of light going forward. The second challenge or opportunity is there is consultation fatigue among employers. Whether this consultation is real or not, there are any numbers of surveys that are going out, and people are not sure whether their input is being taken seriously. But again, I wonder if working with small enterprises and reaching those who have not been reached before is an opportunity for engagement. My third observation is around the whole overrepresentation of selection in the policy narrative of skilled immigrants and the labor market and their labor market integration. There have been a whole slew of almost relentless regulation and policy changes in who gets into the country, and that seems to be where our attention is. Who gets selected, how they get selected. And in a sense, it has created a vacuum in the conversation about what happens when they get here. So hopefully this report, now that the major changes in selection policy are hopefully behind us with express entry, maybe now we can pay attention to what happens when people get here, how can we engage employers, can we implement some of these recommendations. And of course, Matthew has pointed out the constantly changing landscape of immigration. Next, Peter, thank you. And the lack of stability that continues to be part of our landscape, resulting finally in my observation that regardless of how we want to engage employers, it has never been easy. But the report does point out the role of intermediaries, the role of sector councils, the role of local gatherings of employers. In Toronto, we have the Toronto Financial Services Alliance. These are important entry points for engagement to help us move the narrative and the impact further. So with that, I will hand it back to Joan and to the audience.
Thanks, Ratna, and thank you, Matthew. Start typing questions in the question box at the center of your screen so that we can handle the Q&A session. I'm going to start out with a question for, I think, both or either Matthew or Ratna. Many of the you can also download the report now. Sorry, for those of you who've been asking about that. Many of the recommendations in the report are quite specific about the roles of municipal and provincial governments in engaging employers, but the other recommendations seem to target all levels of government. And in that sense, it seems to me that in some ways the federal government is let off the hook, rather than looking at specific things they could do. And I was just wondering if you could suggest something that specifically the federal government should undertake and why it's best positioned to do that. Matthew, maybe, or Andrew?
Let me start, Joan, with putting an idea on the table. And that relates to the vacuum in the policy and the program discussion that I think has been created by the huge focus on who gets in and temporary foreign workers. So perhaps calling on the federal government to do more and do better through employer engagement, and so to effective labor market integration by following some of the recommendations. So that's an idea. And whether we deliberately let the federal government off the hook, I'm not sure about that. I'll let Andrew and Matthew answer that question. But I do think there is an opportunity in time right now to make some gains on the recommendations that have been put forward.
Well, I would, the federal government is the steward of the immigration system, but they don't run the labor market and job training programs. They fund them, but they negotiate and encourage or discourage certain kinds of programs. So I would say that there are things that the federal government needs to get its own house in order on. So the temporary foreign worker program clearly being one of them. And to the extent that the federal government allows employers to use the temporary foreign worker program to recruit both in low-skilled and higher-skilled categories, because some employers think that these employees will be better, in quotation marks, more compliant, less likely to complain, less demanding. I think the federal government has an obligation to stop that and get its own house in order, and to highlight that the temporary foreign worker program was designed as a program of last resort to fill specific things, not as an ongoing piece of the labor market strategy. So I think there's a get your own house in order piece for the federal government around temporary foreign workers, and highlighting that there are many skilled immigrants who are here in Canada, who arrived here through the federal skilled worker program and the point system and wages.
Hello?
Employers should. Hello?
I think you're cutting out a bit, Matthew.
Sorry, is that better?
Yep.
Sorry about that. So, and then the second thing I would say is that in the context of the negotiations around the Canada Job Fund, it is important that the federal government, understand, I won't use the word defer, but understand that provinces and municipalities are exploring employer-driven programs, many of which are working, but also we're trying to shift, and the federal government should, I think, encourage those and not stand in the way.
Okay, thanks. One of the four levers we discussed, the engagement with intermediaries that represent employers like sector councils or industry association, is something that's been tried before with varying degrees of success. It is a role the federal government played in the past, I think, with support from provinces. But what are some new ideas on engagement that might emerge from this research? Anybody?
Well, I think, I don't want to speak for the researchers, but what I'm taken by in the report is the pointing out in many different parts of the report to local expressions of intermediaries. There's the one example that I'm very familiar with is the Toronto Financial Services Alliance, which is an alliance of all the financial services employers in the region. Now, mind you, this is head office region, so it's a very big alliance, but it has organized itself in a way to develop labor market information. It has organized itself in a way that it plays in the box with community colleges that are providing talent, with universities and with community agencies. It has taken policy positions on the kinds of immigrants the GTA needs. So I think those kinds of local institutions that are employer embedded and employer run is a signal in the right direction. I would love to know from the audience whether there are similar employer groups, be they biotech or science or STEM or whatever they may be in other parts of the country.
So I think that the research highlights many things, and I would encourage people to look through the recommendations and the other examples from elsewhere. Things that I would say that struck me as the newest to me would be, as Ratna highlighted, increased engagement with the intermediary organizations and sectoral councils in specific sectors to anticipate labor market needs and to actually place people in jobs. I would say the RAPA Manitoba model, if used appropriate and widely, could be expanded to include really clear pathways for employers to access the skilled workers that they need right now, rather than going through other routes. And I would say that using existing licensing or other legal requirements as moments of engaging employers and highlighting where and how they might be able to fill their labor market needs with skilled immigrants is likewise something that would be important. And I really think it's important that the labor market piece and be better integrated with the economic development piece generally, and the outreach to employers often is about business retention or investment attraction, rather than using that as an opportunity to also engage employers around workforce needs and who might be able to fill them who are already in the community.
Okay, thanks. We are looking forward to more questions from people out there on the webinar, so keep your comments coming or questions coming. One of the things that one of the questions that's come in is, does the report make any recommendations about trying to encourage immigration to areas outside of the major urban centers like Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, Calgary, Edmonton, Ottawa, maybe? Should governments take different approaches to encourage that?
So we didn't engage with that question in the report. This report was really, maybe an overstatement, but this report was not about immigrants. It wasn't about what they can do or where they should go. It was about employers and governments. So in that sense, that wasn't really the focus. But I think you are right, Joan, that there is increasingly going to be more government employer engagement, but also government, municipal government, like provincial government, municipal government engagement to deal with population stagnation or even decline in some communities. And so there's lots of evidence, for example, in small and medium-sized cities in Canada, there are many businesses that are run by entrepreneurs who have run them for decades, and these are successful businesses in small and medium-sized cities, and there is no transition plan in these businesses. And at the same time, one has immigrants who are looking to start businesses and who are exploring entrepreneurial opportunities, usually in larger cities. And so I do think there would be opportunities for governments to engage in that kind of matchmaking service. But this is not a focus of this piece of research, and I'm just kind of talking based on other stuff I have read, and I think that might be something that would certainly be worth exploring and finding ways of connecting businesses in medium-sized cities with no transition plans to immigrant entrepreneurs who are looking to take over a business.
Okay, I have a sort of combination question. one of the recommendations is we talk about provincial employment agencies trying to think of themselves more explicitly as fulfilling an HR function for SMEs. And I was wondering, how do we see that happening? But there's also a question that's come up is, what might be some of the drawbacks of increasing the role of government engagement with employers? So it's kind of both sides of that coin. How do we see the agencies moving into helping with HR functions for SMEs, but also what might be some of the drawbacks?
So I mean, I don't see a lot of drawbacks, and I mean, I'd be interested in exploring those if people have suggestions. There may be ones that I have not thought of, but when we think of a possibility of unemployed Canadians or underemployed Canadians registering in various places with job boards and inventories of people who are looking for work, I think that it would be it is something that government should look at about whether they take those efforts and expand them and drive them forward with a focus on supporting skilled immigrants who sometimes have difficulty navigating our hiring culture and our labor market practices and culture, coupled with SMEs who may not have the capacity and time to reach out and find the labor they need. Every organization knows how time-consuming it is to go out and find people to fill specific needs. There are lots of organizations that do that, but I think government could play a bigger role in that.
Thanks, Matthew. Just because we're coming to the end, I was wondering, Ratna, if you could talk a little bit about how does this report and work on immigrant employment and prosperity tie in with your work at the newly established Global Diversity Exchange at Ryerson?
Oh, thank you. Thanks for that question, Joan. But if I may, because constructive disagreement always adds a nice touch to these virtual web-based conversations. I'll take a slightly different approach from Matthew on whether or not there is a disadvantage to increasing the role of employers on immigration engagement. I think if employers are engaged in immigrant integration, that is great. I really do think that is great, because without employers at the table, we will not get to the desired end result. But over-articulating their role in selecting future Canadians, I think could be a bit of a slippery slope. Perhaps I hark back to the old days when, people like me were selected not because of the specific talents that I had, but because someone saw a future Canadian in me, and a good future Canadian. So the notion that immigration is about nation building as opposed to simply headhunting is something that resonates with me personally on quite loudly. But I do think that there is an appropriate role in sort of advising and engaging with government on what the labor market shortages could be, and working then with government on ensuring that once immigrants are here, that they are included in the labor market. So on the question about GDX and Global Diversity Exchange is three long words, and I think we hope people will get used to calling us GDX. It's very closely allied to this conversation and to hire immigrants, because GDX will explore more deeply the link between prosperity and migration, but it will be more global in its outlook, and because employers are more like each other than unlike each other, regardless of where they may be in the world, we hope to connect them in global movements of change. So we will be relaunching Hire Immigrants as more than a web-based platform. We will, and a real sort of initiative that convenes, questions, discusses, engages, disseminates, replicates, etc. And we will also be launching a new platform focusing on immigrant entrepreneurs. I'm asking people, the people at Maitri, to please type my email address in case you want to hear more about GDX. I'm happy to answer everybody's questions.
Okay, thanks. I think that's all the time we have now. I think we're going over a little bit. Thank you both to Matthew and to Ratna for commissioning and leading the research, and to Andrew, and providing with an insightful overview of how and why government should be at the forefront of engaging employers to improve outcomes for newcomers. There's a lot that needs to be done, but I think the discussion today has highlighted some opportunities, and I thank the panelists for their time and their insights, and I thank you for joining us today. The webinar has been recorded and will be available shortly, along with other past webinars, on the hireimmigrants.ca website, and we'll send you a notice as soon as it's available. And there are other resources here, and when you sign up, there are e-tips. Anyhow, please take a moment to fill out our survey and tell us what you thought of the webinar and what topics you'd like us to cover in the future. The survey will appear shortly. Thanks again, and see you at the next webinar.